and reimagining politics. And we are a hybrid meeting. Our wonderful speaker today is Philippe Schmitter, who doesn't need any introduction, the father of democracy studies in Europe and around the world. So basically a savior of the world from the academic side. I'm just, whatever. But seriously, we all know Philippe has been thinking about these issues for many decades and putting in the world very, very provocative and important concepts like neo-corporatism and neo-functionalism. And now we're talking about post-democracy. There's neos and posts, but also
not post-liberal.
Post-liberal democracy. Indeed, what we're going to do is ask you to kind of introduce yourself the first time you speak. Probably that will be just more easy. But I would like to say that this is the first meeting of this year's meeting of the Transnational Democracy in the 21st Century Cluster VUI, one of 6 clusters, trans-department and research clusters. Our cluster is transforming and reinventing as we speak. And as of January, we will be formally the new version of the cluster, which is actually chaired by Philippe Schmitter, who is online. Philippe, I don't see you. Oh, you're there. You're on another screen. Hello. Hello, Philippe. So you're co-convening the seminar with me, above all co-convening the cluster, and myself. And our vision for this cluster is very much as an ongoing trans-EUI conversation, as well as with our friends beyond EUI. And this conversation has to do with transnational democracy in a writ large. And we were just talking with Philippe about the fact that we all understand that transnational democracy includes national, includes city, includes every level, that it is grounded on the health of democracy everywhere. So
and you should call it multi-layered or multi-level.
Multi-layered, multi-level, polycentric, subsidiarity democracy, but it's a bit too much of a mouthful. And in fact, part of the conversation we really want to have is indeed, what is transnational democracy? How do you make it better? And this is why we did think that there was no better way to start this conversation for this academic year, but hopefully the next 2 or 3 years, with Philippe's project, which very soon will not just be called Philippe's project. And I want here to recognize on my left, she's very well known to everyone here, but Ulrike Liebert, who is also a pillar of the Transnational Democracy Cluster, works with Andrea, and of course, Eric Jones, director of the Schumann Center, has been super active there too. And Ulrike very much will be a point person for the project that we're going to be discussing today. So just so you know, and right after I'm finished, she will provide also an introduction. But what I would like to say in introducing the overall meeting today is that we will do 2 things. We will discuss the specific papers that Philippe has made available for us on substance. So until something like 1 o'clock. But then we want to have a last part dedicated to how we're going to put this project together. And the project will be one of the projects of the cluster. And it's a project that hopefully will bring together a number of short papers, around 2,000 words. We're not talking long papers, each around a concept and specific proposal. So combining concepts and proposals. In the spirit of the papers that Philippe has already provided, many of those at the beginning will be Philippe's papers, but the overall umbrella, the Europolitan papers, will be a collective endeavor where we all contribute academic papers with concrete proposals and enable commentaries. Commentaries will then take the shape of a paper, or they can be shorter commentaries, and this will evolve organically. So we're very, very excited about this project. And it's a project that Philippe has held in his heart for a long time. I have a small amendment, and I mean, I've discussed the overall idea, with Philippe already. My personal small amendment is that it should not refer to the Federalist Paper of the United States. Because, people smile, it sounds a bit, puffed up. Pretentious, thank you. I didn't want to use the word Philippe because I wanted to, sounds pretentious. And plus, been there, done that, that was 200 years ago and very different. And plus, we don't want the EU to be the United States of Europe. Giscard was obsessed with the Federalist Paper and it didn't help in 2005. Many reasons. And we don't have to make this decision today, but that was my amendment, Philip. I've pre-warned you, so just to be fair. Okay, so after this short introduction, I will absolutely give you the floor to say a few words. Can we assume everyone has kind of looked at the papers that were sent around? I think, so Philip, we can assume that everyone has looked at the papers. So you can remind people, point to some pointers, and then Ulrike will say something about the general project and her commentary on paper 1. And then Eric will make commentaries on paper 5. And then there's we had a commentator for paper 9, Daniele, but he can't come. So, and that's about parties, so everyone can chip in. But this is how we will proceed, and then we open up. Philip, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I hope that you have been able to read these papers. They're deliberately kept short and they're deliberately aimed at a broader audience than academics. Although I found out the more and more I started writing, the more and more I ended up putting in footnotes, which I had originally not intended to have any footnotes whatsoever, but you can't help it, I guess. Basic idea, focus on the making or transforming the EU, which is already a polity in a technical sense of the word. That is to say, it can make binding decisions on people within a given space, let's say, but it's a deficient polity. And much more, because of the crises that it is simultaneously condemned to have to deal with, it's becoming even more and more defective all the time. So this issue of the legitimacy of the EU, especially a legitimacy based, at least for many people, on rather orthodox notions of what a democracy should be like, is becoming an increasingly severe problem. So it's not something which is there still, which reminds me, you're absolutely right. I was inspired by the Federalist Papers, but there are two reasons why it doesn't work. In addition to the other one, namely, I'm not as intelligent as Alexander Hamilton and James Monroe. Okay, but that's another issue. Mainly, of course, is that they had a concrete proposal in front of them, which they could argue from and about. We don't have that. In fact, one of the main arguments in the papers is forget about a constitution or even a major treaty revision. So the entire focus of the papers are on this, I keep repeating it, I think, several times, the famous phrase of Jean Monnet, petits pas, grands effets. So what are little things one might imagine to be feasible, but which would produce? So this notion that you're talking about a process and not a product. So in that sense, it's very different than the Federalist Papers. And of course, there are many other things as well, but I appreciate that. I just couldn't help saying something at the very end about that. So that's the basic idea then. Petits pas, grands effets. Trying to look for relatively modest changes which do not require a treaty, certainly not a new constitution, and maybe only certain modest treaty changes, but even just simply in-house. And I must say that the EU has been rather inventive with new concepts and new arrangements. So it's not as if the people in Brussels don't have creative ideas and introduce little things. So we can hope that maybe they'll pick up on some of these. Finally, there's absolutely no discussion in any of the papers I've written about, quote, feasibility. The idea is to throw out the ideas and then see whether anybody or anything happens, but not to inhibit your imagination by simply saying, oh my God, this is never going to be how should I say, legislated or approved by member states. So that's all. It's experimental and intended to just start a discussion rather than to necessarily lead to concrete specific effects. Thank you.
Wow. Well, that was succinct and to the point, Philip, and I think very
I wanted to
important.
give you the spirit of the enterprise.
No, and it's important and just inventive. It might be the case that people who want to contribute will themselves want to have a feasibility test, and we can leave that open for discussion. But now let me turn to Ulrike for commentary on the first paper. And let us say that there are, right now already written about a dozen papers of 2,000 words. So this is, already you've done a lot of work. So we all need to catch up. We all need to catch up with you, Philip. This is quite a challenge you've sent to us. And I'm very happy that we're going to pick it up.
Yeah, there are 13 chapters already, or essays, and several more in the pipeline, I've learned. Fruit of some maybe provocations regarding the state of the art of the development of democratic institutions, innovations, practices, the Conference on the Future of Europe, deliberative participatory citizens assemblies, and so there will be chapters that will also cover these more recent developments. Now, for some 40 years now, we have been working again and again together in different contexts here at CUI, doctoral thesis, postdoctoral project. So I'm happy that you have, that Philippe has gotten back to, what I always valued very much, bring together the work at the crossroads as a researcher, as a theorist, at the crossroads of comparative politics, comparative economic politics, political economy, but also institutionalism and international relations, European integration. So Ernie Haas was one of your fathers, right? Doctoral.
I learned that from Ernie, yes.
Yeah, and so this is not so frequent to bring together these two fields, and I find this extremely important and productive. What Philippe has been also, why he has been awarded, I remember at one of the IPSA congresses, an award, for lifetime achievement, something as a political scientist.
Something, yeah.
And I remember
Mate Gauguin.
Mate Gauguin.
Honor of Mate.
So, and what became clear to me, what was the leading thread in your vast scholarly work is conceptual work. So finding and promoting and working out key concepts that have inspired whole research fields, like of course neo-corporatism or the transition to democracy, a transition from authoritarianism in Latin America. And
it wasn't transitions to democracy,
not
transitions from
authoritarianism.
Okay.
And then democratic consolidation. And now a few years ago when I was here as a visiting, we had a seminar where I presented a paper on democratic deconsolidation, which was in the context of the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis. And so we are still living in the not in the aftermath, but we are observing now the unfolding of this process. And the unfolding, which has had tremendous effects empirically, phenomenologically, structurally, institutionally on democracy. The crisis you bring together in your introduction to your project, the series of multiple and mutually reinforcing crises with the mounting deficits of democracy. And that's what is for my work also pivotal. And why is this the case? There's very much discussion about that and analysis, and bringing that down to maybe one of the mechanisms is that there has been executive technocratic empowerment due and in reaction to the crisis. And that means disempowerment of parliamentary democracy, of party democracy, and very much of the disaffection of citizens, of voters, of young people has to do with this powerlessness. So getting now into the more closer reading of your introduction, which is your first paper, which is 1 to 3.5 pages only, you are talking very shortly about citizens. And I would say, you say citizens will possess vested interests and identities in this Europolity that can be brought to bear in different combinations to solve different conflicts and exploit different opportunities. There is still a little bit this functionalist, neo-functionalist terminology, yeah? So they can effectively, or they can function with different interests in different contexts. But the more tremendous truth, I think, is that citizens have if you look at the work of the European Health Agency in Copenhagen, I think it's located, depression is really among young people, among Europeans, is mounting, is growing as a consequence of COVID, of lockdown policies and so on. So there is a deep sense of disempowerment up to depression, which really democracies, it's not a healthy fertile ground for democracy and renovating democracies. So proposals for a project, for a Europolitan project, need, if we want this to fly, and I think we need something that would stir and revitalize hope in the future. Optimism, there is something which can be done despite and now the war, the war context, of course, So and therefore I think concepts are very important, and your concept Europolity, I like it very much. Reminds me a bit of the work of Patricia Nantz also, but Habermas and Bakhtin and dialogical. So I was reflecting about, you say from liberal democracy, yes, this doesn't work anymore. This has led to these frustrations and crisis and disengagement. And you have described this in other chapters and parts of your work. And where will we go? This Europolity, it needs to be democratic, you stress this, and you, in the other chapters, you develop also how this should look like. But we need a concept for it. And the concept as a post-liberal democracy, it's not very satisfying. It won't
we
fly.
have to do better than that.
And I have a proposition, which is not mine exactly, but you say in several, you use the word deliberate, the deliberate formation of the democratic Europolity, the deliberate formation. And this is something to do with deliberation, maybe with deliberative democracy.
No. Not to do with deliberation. Deliberate in this case means self-confessed or openly admitted.
But this is also a theoretical, not only theoretical, but also a practical program of renewing democratic practices, theories and practices, and especially in the European Union, which is a new forms, procedures which involve citizens in ways that they have not been involved over the past decades or so. So this would be one of my, how I feel challenged. And of course, your essays, they need to challenge people in order to make them react. And my reaction to this challenge of post-liberal democracy would be, why not work out this conception of deliberative democracy, the deliberative turn of democracy, a transnational democracy. This is one of my points I wanted to make. But I think it's important to bring citizens' voices, expectations more upfront. From a micro perspective, to connect the microcosmos of citizens' life worlds to the macrocosmos of European EU institutional life, the Brussels bubble also. And I like very much that you return to the origins of democracy in the Politeia in number 5. So I will pass on to Eric now. Maybe give you a chance to react once we have both.
Well, let me just one reaction to that, and it is in the paper that I am promising or working on. The basic problem that you got your finger on it. I mean, the basic problem is that we're talking about potentially democratizing Europolity at a moment in which democracy in all of its member states is in very bad condition. In fact, if there's, I think I say this several points, if there is a democracy deficit, it's much bigger at the national level than it is at the European level, simply because people's expectations are so much more established and substantial at the national level. And that's a very special kind of problem. And then you brought up this question of deliberation. I'm writing a paper which is, quote, absolutely anti-deliberation. That is to say, I think it is a fundamental mistake. I think you have to recognize that because of scale and because of the diversity of identities as well as interests that any Europolity would have to deal with, it has to rest on representation. And therefore, representation, of course, participation, deliberation at the bottom. But then you have to go through a series of stages. And so you can have deliberation among representatives, for example, but you have to recognize that the direct role of citizens will become even more indirect in an eventual Euro democracy. So that's my argument. It's maybe not one that is shared, but this is where I'm headed. But anyway, as I say, the basic context, however, is you have a problem of democratizing the EU at a moment in which democracy at the national level is even more seriously defective than that at the European level in relationship to what people expect.
Okay, so I think that for the people online and people in the room, I would say hold your fire. There's much to say already about this first interaction between Ulrike and Philippe at two levels. One is kind of the label for what we're all after is their common label. And then the other is the bigger question of this triangle. I mean, these kinds of democracy, and we can throw in all sorts of adjectives: radical democracy, agonistic democracy, atomistic democracy, you name it. And so one of the meta questions for all of us is, if we do this project, whether there is a common roof or whether we'll, I mean, if there is a common roof, how abstract would it be? Because clearly we will totally disagree on this last question, at least it's from my end, and that's fine because you want a conversation. So let's give the floor to Eric and then open up. Eric.
Okay, so first, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. And second, many apologies. I have a hard stop around 1 o'clock, so I have to leave before you do the deliberations that follow. Philippe very generously sent me the whole collection of papers. And so although Ulrike gave me precise guidance to focus on paper number 5, I actually read the whole thing. And that actually turns out to be important because paper number 5 is the paper that describes the interventions that we can put in to try to solve the problem. But if you don't know what the problem is and you don't know what the interventions are meant to achieve, then it's challenging to focus on it. So let's start with the problem. The problem is not that the European institutions have changed. There's a story of institutional change that emanates from globalization and from the financial dominance or dominance of global financial capital that causes the institutions to respond periodically in the context of crisis. And I think what Philippe does is a very good job showing how the institutions respond in ever increasingly innovative ways. So the ability of the institutions of the European Union to respond is not the problem. There's something deeper that's going on. And there, I think that there are two elements that are missing. One is the whole conversation about politicization of Europe. that we've engaged with. So there's no talk about the post-functionalist turn that Gary Marx and Lisbeth Hoche would argue, which says that the institutions in their response to crisis have extended beyond acceptable boundaries. And I think implicitly in the paper, that argument is rejected by Philippe, because Philippe mentions time and again that when we do surveys of people, although the surveys may show that there's some disaffection with European institutions, that disaffection washes out very quickly. And there's a lot more content with European institutions than there is with national institutions, for example. So there's one theory of politicization that doesn't seem to apply, but that nevertheless probably should be addressed explicitly. There's a second theory of politicization that Philippe alludes to only by dint of the author's name, and that's Peter Mayer. And Peter Mayer's theory of the politicization of European institutions is that European institutions were created to upload policies out of the democratic arena. And Peter has this line that I think would be worth Philippe engaging with, where Peter says, if the European institutions were democratic, be needed in the first place, because the whole reason we need these institutions is to get policy out of the democratic arena. Now, this notion of politicization, Mayer then goes on to say, is that these institutions deny meaningful political opposition, and without meaningful political opposition, then people get frustrated and they turn against and delegitimate these non-majoritarian institutions along the way. And I think that's part of what Philippe is arguing in terms of the delegitimation of these institutions, but it would be helpful if that were clarified so we have a better sense of what the dysfunction is. And this is the second thing that I think needs to be elaborated more clearly, because the dysfunction of national democracy, both at the European level and at the national level in the European context, the question that immediately springs to my mind is, this is dysfunction of institutions, that they're not designed to fit the needs of the day, or is this a dysfunction of the norms with which the institutions are managed? And that's a Ziblatt and I forgot.
All the norms with which citizens, I mean, that post-functionalist argument was that the norms of citizens have changed so much. So there's a third.
So the line, the post-functionalist line from Marx and Hoche is that the citizens haven't changed at all. They've always been Eurosceptical. It's just that they've become aware of it. And so I think there's a good point for you to make in terms of debating that. But this dysfunction, if the dysfunction is in institutional design, that suggests one set of interventions. If the dysfunction is in terms of the way institutions are being used, then that suggests a very different set of interventions. And this is the backdrop to the interventions that are offered in chapter 5 or in the fifth paper. Most of the interventions are technical interventions that are designed to increase democratic participation and to change the way democratic participation works by creating transnational constituencies, by lowering the voting age, by extending suffrage to parents of minors, and in so doing, try to foster a more obvious European community. Now, what I think is interesting about that in the context of the American experience is that none of those institutions exist in the Constitution of the United States, right? As a matter of fact, in the United States, we have one of the things that Philippe argues is that we should have the same electoral system everywhere in Europe, but in the Constitution of the United States, it explicitly provides for diversity in those electoral systems. And so I wonder how.
There's one reason why we don't know the results of the elections of the 2 days ago yet. So
absolutely, and we won't know the results for Georgia because, unlike most states, Georgia requires a runoff unless a candidate gets more than 50% of the votes. And so given these technical interventions, I think it's interesting because I agree with Philippe that we should set aside the political question of whether these interventions would ever be adopted, but that doesn't mean we can set aside the mechanical questions that are, if we adopt this intervention, what would be the impact on democratic performance, either in terms of the way people engage with democratic institutions or the way they perceive them. And this reflects on the other thing that Philippe does, I think, very well in the papers, is express a certain theory of representation. And the theory of representation, I think, makes an interesting contrast with the most famous of the Federalist Papers, Federalist 10, because what Philippe argues is that representation should take place not simply through the electoral process, but also through groups, right? And his idea is to move toward a more collective identity-based notion of representation, either in a consociational model based on pillarized societies, or through a more functional interest representation that looks a little bit more like corporatism. And at different points in the papers, he argues that both forms of representation should be added into the more democratic expression, which then makes you reflect back on the interventions, the institutional changes per se, to ask whether these interventions will have that as an effect, or whether we need to foster those forms of representation separately. And this is where I think the papers really need to be fleshed out a bit more, which is what is the notion or theory of progress in this context? At times, I get the sense that the theory of progress is all based on building a European polity. But I guess my question would be, would most Europeans regard that as progress, or would they regard that as a threat to their national identity? That's the question. Why does Luxembourg even exist anyway, right? Because there's no reason for Luxembourg, except for that Luxembourgers prefer to have Luxembourg than not to have it. You see what I mean? And then indeed, it would be interesting if Luxembourgers or anyone else in Europe would rather have a European polity rather than their national political identity per se. And I'm not quite sure the interventions described in the fifth paper actually push us toward that strong form of national identity. But I am sure it's worth asking the question whether if they did, they would generate more of a backlash than a strengthening of European democracy per se.
Eric, I think the point I try to make is to avoid what I think was the error you just made, namely to assume that identities are exclusive. People can have multiple identities. So there's no reason why you would, becoming more European, you'd necessarily become less or anti-Luxembourgeois, whatever that is in English. So,
but I think
you've got that, but that is a mentality which there certainly are people who believe that. But as I say, I think you have to recognize that the possibility of holding multiple identities and actually enjoying having multiple identities.
But then we would also need to recognize the possibility that people would embrace an identity to the exclusion of others, which is what explains Brexit to a certain extent, and the take back control notion, or secessionism in the Basque region, or in the Catalan region, or in Scotland. So I agree with you completely that we can have multiple identities, but the question is that really what people want? And that's an empirical question, not a theoretical question, I would argue.
Indeed, and of course, that's one of the challenge of this conversation is part of it is empirical, part of it is, so in this case, for instance, there's been Eurobarometer polling on these four, options on this paper, question of identity. Are you national only, European only, or in between, more national than European, more European than national? And it's been pretty stable over time. But that's, empirical, and there are other empirical bits to the story. Then there is the theoretical post-functionalism, what kind of Europe are we in from the European studies? And then there is normative. This is Eric's, theory of progress. That is what, and I think as this conversation progresses, it'd be great if people kind of put it on the table. Philippe has put on the table, not clearly enough, and that's what Eric is telling us, his normative, this question of what is progress, what is good for the future of the EU. And I'm not sure it's entirely centralizing. I want to say something about that. But then we all have, and perhaps I'm going to throw it back at Eric, what is your theory of progress? Because at least for me, for the last 20 years, I've put my cards on the table. I have had and put forward, a democratic understanding of my theory of progress, which is to stay very stubbornly on this third way. And resisting both nationalist sirens and supranationalist sirens. And so for me, if I read paper 5, echoing Eric, and react to Philippe's proposals, as Eric described, Philippe gives us very concrete ways of spurring more participation under the assumption that citizens' disgruntlement is not about the what Europe does, and Catherine de Vries is also pretty clear on that. The people and the polls show it repeatedly, 70–80% of people want Europe to do more health, more this, more that, but how it does. So I think we should always distinguish between the what and the how. And if we do, as far as I'm concerned, I read Philippe's proposal and I say, well, I like this because it gives us more transnational, horizontal connections, like transnational lists, for instance, a very old hat, but that you want to, revisit, and that's great. But if it's centralizing and standardizing, then I have problems with that. A bit like Eric vis-a-vis the US, diversity. I think it's a good price to pay to wait for a month for Georgia. I don't mind if it gives people the sense in the US that they're in control. This morning on the radio, you had people in Georgia that were really proud. The whole US will be looking at us for the next month, to see what, senators will do. I think that's great, but we can disagree. But the beauty of it is that's the beauty of your papers, Philippe, is that we can disagree about them, agree with X%, disagree, or else there's no conversation. So on this note, you answered directly to Eric and Ulrike, but do you want to add anything, or do you want to listen to some of the reactions from everybody? What would you prefer?
Well, let me just bring up the topic which I addressed in number 9, which unfortunately Daniele is not here to discuss. Just to put it on the table, and that is to say, the focus is on the creation of a European party system. It is my understanding that citizens' understanding of democracy, no matter how alienated they may be at the present moment from political parties, and the evidence is overwhelming, and the membership and identification, the chances that a given citizen will vote twice in a row for the same party is lower than it's ever been, for example, and that's almost true in every country, not just in Italy, among others, maybe extreme case in Italy. So I bring that issue up and I just ask people to think about it, but I'm assuming that one of the things that would emerge or could emerge from some of the things that I suggest, but hopefully others will as well, that it is impossible to conceive of a Europe-wide democracy without a European party system, without people feeling that there are institutions which represent their interests effectively and even emotionally at the European level. Now, that's a hell of a challenge because political parties have never been more despised or underestimated or whatever it is in the history of liberal democracy than these days. So what do you do about political parties and what kind of things could possibly lead to a European party system? That's what I discussed in number 9.
Thank you. And again, here we could ask, well, can it be top down, bottom up? Eric wants to jump in. And Eric, I want to say, before you leave at 1, we want to give you one last moment to comment on the overall. Before you leave, if you want to hold the up.
I'm putting 2 fingers up on the pan-European party system for 2 reasons, I think, both of which are empirical. One is it's instructive to look at the dissolution of the Belgian party system after the 1993 constitutional reform in that country. They had a pan-Belgian party system, and now the party systems don't have any points of interface at all. And that's a fascinating thing to observe because it suggests that the different patterns of representation in different parts of the country are fundamentally different. And so the creation of a pan-European party system might not be stable. The other thing I would point to is the 2017 article by Dan Kellerman in Government and Opposition, where he looks at the way national political parties cover for subnational forms of authoritarianism. He uses the example of the United States, the way that both the Democratic and the Republican Party supported authoritarian groups at the state level. We can call that now the Herschel Walker effect, if you wanted to put a name on it. And equally, you can see how the EPP actually ran cover for Fidesz for many, many years in order to allow Fidesz to go and do what it was doing until finally it was just too embarrassing. And now the EPP, lacking Fidesz, is busy courting Giorgia Meloni so that they can do that with an Italian flavor to it, right? So I think it's worth us paying attention to these possibilities.
Thank you, Eric. I'm sure everybody here in the room and there wants to, I'm looking at the screen for hands up, but since we don't have a hand, oh, we have Nicolo, but I'm also looking at the room, Veronica, Thomas, Andrea, please, but we'll start with Nicolo and then whoever else. Yes, Nicolo.
Thanks very much, Philip, for the papers, and I very much support the project of Europolitan Papers. I'm Niccolo Milanese. I'm in Paris for the past 15 years. I've been running an organization called European Alternatives Promoting Transnational Democracy with Calypso and Ulrika and others. I have 2 points. One is related to post-liberalism. It's striking in the papers that are shared there is no proposal relating to the social dimension of the European Union. And yet this is an area in which various initiatives have been taken recently. The European Labour Authority, discussions about minimum wages, collective bargaining, and so on. And surely the material conditions for European democracy are an important consideration, particularly at a moment where there's a massive cost of living crisis. And so where is the social dimension? Is it in another paper or is it another paper that needs to be written?
Coming, and now I'm relying very particularly on Philippe from Paris, but others. So yes, there will be definitely, we hope, some attention to that. You're right.
But it's not from you, maybe it's from others.
I can, but I'm much more qualified than I am.
And I think it's really important, that people who are spurred in writing things, 2,000 words. So Nicolo, whether it's on the social dimension or anything else, but you're so right that.
No, but let me say that where you see the hint of it is in the constant emphasis on direct effect. And the assumption I'm making there is that a lot of the direct effect should be social. But what kinds of policies? I want people who know a lot more than I do about that to advance that. But that's very much part of that concept of direct effect. So, and I would, of course, what I'm supporting, of course, would be a minimal income. I've written an article actually with one of my students on a minimal income for those who make less than 1/3 of the average wage in each of the respective countries. And I even calculated how you could pay for it, but I'm not good at that. That's not my thing.
Okay. Well,
okay.
Did you want to add something on that?
My second point was precisely on direct effect, because in the first paper that you have shared with us, there is the underlying organizational principle of subsidiarity, which you define as preference should always be accorded to that unit which is closest in distance and identity to those most directly affected. And it seems to me that this is a crucial point for us to focus on in relation to the discussion that was just being had, because a striking feature of many of the crises that are affecting the European Union, most notably the ecological crisis, but not only, is the difficulty of identifying who is most directly affected and what is externalities at any one point of time. And so it seems to me the concept of subsidiarity needs some reflection, which goes beyond the question of whether power should be more centralized or power should be decentralized, rather towards an idea perhaps of translocal cooperation between different local authorities or between different levels, and the difficulty of stabilizing and predicting which authorities and which levels are going to be relevant for a particular issue over time. That seems to me, and I finish with this, a crucial role also of civil society and citizens, who can be much more fluid and responsive than political institutions can. And so working with your idea of consociational models or corporatism and so on, I want to support the idea that civil society has a really crucial role to play, precisely to get us out of a kind of subsidiarity trap and a very vertical vision and static vision of how that ought to look.
Thank you, Nicola.
Well, but that's exactly good for you. I mean, this is, but somebody has to write an essay, because this is exactly where the two basic principles, you have subsidiarity on one and you have solidarity on the other. Solidarity implies inter-unit transfers of some kind and some kind of effort of upward grading and convergence in living standards or even income or whatever it is, right? So those two, you have to work those two out, so to speak. But that's why I, insisted on solidarity. But solidarity then implies or has implications for subsidiarity. I need somebody who's a lot smarter than I am to figure out how you can put those two together into a winning package, so to speak.
Well, right, and we're back to Eric's point about institutional design versus norms, which is such an important point that you made, because in this story that Nicola is talking about, well, you can go somewhere with institutional design. For instance, indeed, having much more channels and structures for citizens' deliberation and participation across borders and across cities, very important here in Florence. But it's also about a norm of consultation, etc.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you, Nicola. And it sounds like you're going to be drafted to write this version of the paper. Parenthetically, when you said direct effect, part of this story is just simply describing and analyzing what the EU is before even prescribing. Direct effect is the very core of the normative architecture of the EU, the direct effect by the court. This has been anti-social. I mean, to a great extent. So we can write a whole paper on this, on the anti-social dimension of direct effect, because local bargains, trade union bargains, have not been respected in the name of transborder free movement. And there's a huge critique of that in the literature. And what you replace it with is really, really key to our story both on the solidarity and on the subsidiarity side. You can't, in the name of free movement, disregard these corporate bargains, neo-corporatist bargains in member states, or can you? So now I have Michael Sanfi with a hand up on screen.
Thank you so much. Fascinating discussion. Just two very brief points, if I may, both regarding paper number 5. And the first one concerns the idea to lower the voting age to 16. Just personally, I realize Philippe is just throwing out ideas and all to the good. I personally think that's too young, but the more problematic aspect of that for me would be the idea of children being enfranchised by having one of their parents vote in lieu. Does that mean that parents might actually have 2 votes, which it would seem a bit funny? Would the parent vote for the child and for himself or herself? Then the other point just concerns the idea of moving away from the elimination of unanimity in the European Council. I happened to attend a lecture. I attended a talk in June by Jim Kloos, now with the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, former senior official. And he's very much in favor of unanimity and feels it's served the EU very well. Now, that's just one voice. But I would ask the question, take the idea of a European army. If you decided to have a European army on anything other than a basis of unanimity, would that not be awfully problematic? And thank you very much for letting me have those few words. Thank you.
Yes. No, I very much.
So first, the voting age. Just you responded yes.
Well, no, I mean, that goes back, but I mean, the basic, it has 2 parts. It has 2 underlying ideas. I don't remember if I've mentioned them in the thing. One, of course, is to encourage younger people to vote. So you give them 2 votes, they may be more likely to vote. But more important than that, it's to set up an intergenerational communication. One of the most startling results of survey research is the breakdown in intergenerational communication about party. So I always cite the Italian case because the Italians and the Greeks had the highest. So it's over 80% of Italians and Greeks in the late 1960s, young people knew who their parents were voting for. So there was a transmission. That has now gone down to the low 20s in the case of Italy, in part because the parents probably voted for two different parties anyway, so it's impossible. So that whole breakdown in how people would get socialized and brought into a kind of political identity, I would like to encourage that by having parents voting, and kids will then want to know who they voted for. So there.
Philippe, before you answer the unanimity side of the question, Eric is leaving. Last words.
Oh, no, just thanks. This is a great conversation. I'm really glad. Philippe, thank you so much for all the hard work you did. And we'll talk about the practical side.
Thank you,
Okay,
Eric.
ciao,
Thanks
ciao,
for-
ciao,
Thank you
ciao.
for coming down the hill. Okay, so Michael had a second part. So on the youth vote, of course, Philippe Van Parijs has been championing this for a long time. And I a bit like Michael, and as a parent of two, I mean, I would be a bit wary of, if the kids can vote themselves, that's fine. I'm a bit wary of the parents voting in their stead, because that's a bit authoritarian. But
Terry, what-
yeah, the parents vote for the kids. I mean, how do the kids know what the parents vote? And some parents.
Because they ask, that's what I want them to do, they will ask. I mean, for goodness.
Yeah, but they trust the parents. Okay, that's one conversation, but another that Michael raised, and I think it's important to remind everyone that at the end of paper 5, if I may, Philippe, discusses the fact that unanimity made sense at the beginning, but with time and as countries know each other better, does it still make sense? And then he has this proposal of this collegium of having 3 groups of member states for the large, medium, and small countries, and that you would need all 3 of them, but within each you would have majority voting. And if a state didn't like that, there could be differentiated integration. So it's in the paper well, we already have differentiated integration. We need to point out that in some areas you can't do it.
Yes.
Single market, rule of law, and the other caveat is, of course, that there are externalities. So it's very hard to simply say, okay, there was no unanimity, we'll just do it on our end, but there are externalities. So it's complicated.
Afterwards with the permission of those who stay in, but anyway, okay.
Okay, but the differentiation is a very complicated dossier, but you have this proposal, Michael, that's the one you're after, right? Is the proposal that you have 3 groups of states and they each vote by majority voting. So we really give up the veto. And,
That's the idea, is to move toward that, at the same time trying to ensure that there is no probability that somehow large states will combine and impose a majority decision on smaller states. Now, I have to say, a footnote, I proposed this once in Copenhagen at a meeting, and a man jumped up in the back and said, Denmark will never approve of this, because Denmark, we Danes will never admit we're a small state. He turned out to be a former foreign minister of Denmark. And so I guess if you count in Greenland, you're all right, I suppose. So anyway, so as I say, there is a problem there simply because somehow the status of small states seems to offend some countries more than others, but that's a practical matter. I mean, but anyway, the idea was to simply have a mechanism to ensure that there would be no hegemon or no hegemonic dominance of the decision-making, but to get rid of the single unit, the librum veto, the single unit, single member veto, so to speak.
Ulrike.
This brings me to the question I had from the beginning on. You discard constitutional, European constitution, constitutional process, even treaty change. To do away with the unanimity voting rule, is this possible without changing the treaties? I don't think so.
I don't know. I mean, they have invented all sorts of quote differentiations. There's an incredible vocabulary of decision-making of partial this and partial that. So I don't know, but they have been inventing extra
So
constitutional.
there is a passerelle clause from the Lisbon Treaty that allow member states to switch to majority voting in a unanimous way. So it kind of defeats the purpose, but makes sense. And it's not structural. It will be because they want to vote on something but not forever. It's complicated, the passerelle system. Thomas is shaking his hand. I just want to check, and Claudia has a hand up, but I want to check that everyone on screen can hear us, that the acoustics are good. Yes, okay, excellent. All right, so Thomas, I'm going to turn to you in a minute, but before that, I will take Claudia, who has a hand up and is against a very beautiful blue sky.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is my Frankfurt rooftop. So the balcony that I have in front of my writing desk. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I can hear
Okay,
you.
cool.
Can't see you speaking for some reason, but not okay.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Philippe, for these papers. We discussed them when I was in Florence this spring, and I think I told you that I agree with most of the points that you made. And I have a couple of comments and 2 points that I think would deserve more discussion. So the comment regards the formation of European identity, which has been one of my core topics of research in the last 15 years. So I would say it is really a complex process that involves top-down elements and bottom-up elements. And I had the impression that you had more the top-down elements, concentrating on parties, saying, which I so totally agree to. So it's the duty of European political parties to help constructing European identity. And then I think there is this bottom-up side that gets into the picture too. And the bottom-up side would be democratic practice. It would be citizens identifying to the European Union, which brings me sort of to my 2 points that I would like to highlight. The first point has been briefly highlighted at the beginning of this session. Could be named politicization and debate. So is EU politicization good or is it bad? I know it's really critically discussed in EU studies, whether it's good or bad. And I would argue it's maybe not always good for the EU, but it's needed. So we need a debate on the European Union. And I would really like to hear what you think on this idea that we would need a debate on the EU's common good. So what is it that the EU aims for? What is the goal? What do we need this Europe for? What do we want it to do? And I would like to highlight that it's all the more important with the war now. Yeah, Europe is in the middle of a war. It is de facto a party in this war. So I think it would be beneficial to discuss rather widely what is this good for? And that can be happening in the national arenas. So I don't see why we shouldn't discuss EU fiscal policy just as we discuss national welfare policy. So that's my first point. And the second addition is, what about redistribution? It's the standard truth in democracy research that people agree with a polity that delivers the output that they appreciate. So apparently there has been some disagreement with the output the EU delivered, especially when you look into the Greek support for EU membership.
Sorry, we didn't hear you. Can you repeat that sentence?
Sorry. Okay, so I would say there has been some problems with EU redistribution and with the EU policy output, especially in the financial crisis and especially in Greece. So the Greeks used to be the most Europhile and now are the most Eurosceptic citizens in the European Union before and after the financial crisis. So I know it's a complex task, but I would like to hear what you think of redistribution, of creating EU taxes, and whether you think that a next generation EU is a step into the right direction or not. That's it. I hope you could hear me.
Very good. Okay, now the identity question first. This is kind of embarrassing, although you gave an answer. If you look at the history of European countries, the main creator of national identity is war. Simple. War or revolution helps too, okay? But that kind of event, let's say, but particularly war. And of course, Europe is in a war right now, and to a certain extent, nobody imagined, I think, prior to this Ukrainian fiasco, that the Europeans would respond in such a, I won't say unanimous is maybe a bit strong, but very, very imposing, singular way. Now, I'm not saying that the Ukrainian war is going to create European identity, but certainly somebody mentioned the idea that maybe out of the European war will come some kind of Euro-NATO or some kind of Eurocentric or Euro coordinated and even perhaps actual European military units, which will be, transnationally or whatever you want to call it, guided or whatever. So obviously from the papers, I don't entertain that. The idea here is that the simple participation and having a greater direct effect will create slowly and in a different way some kind of national unity. Certainly European party system would contribute to that. But you put a finger on something, if you look at it historically, it's a very delicate matter. It's a question of national identities and where it comes and when it comes and what it tends to be associated with. Now, redistribution, here the biggest problem, I don't know. There are, of course, redistributive parties, solidarity funds of various kinds. Many of which apparently have been misused. So some of the worst accusations against the EU have been in corruption associated with the European misuse of European funds. And of course, it's not the European level that's doing that. It's the national authorities, because the European Union has no direct administrative capability for redistributing. It has to redistribute them to national authorities. And very often, Hungary is a country that comes into mind, but I'm sure it happens elsewhere, those funds get distributed in ways which are not necessarily coordinate or synonymous with the, so that's back to this question of direct effect. I mean, and you could have some kinds of European presence, a European minimum wage, for example, or various other kinds of, I would prefer more than that, but that sort of thing. And then presumably you would have to, as always, in the case of Europe, you rely indirectly on conformity to the law and then expect to somehow monitor and therefore enforce that conformity. That's the way it has worked, and I don't see that changing. I don't see the EU creating a labor department or a ministry of labor or whatever it is for all of Europe. That seems, no, it will have to rely on national, but it will have to be better at monitoring and telling people how they're monitoring and, so to speak, punishing or, but that's the way you do it. I think you have to do it indirectly. So those are my reaction to those two things. I think there is room there for the creation of a European identity, even more so now that these crises, especially the Ukrainian one, but others as well, people are, I think, accepting. And the other thing, of course, it's very encouraging, and the data show this, is, I think, without any, is the literally monotonic effect of age on Europeanness. So the younger you are, the more likely. So, again, back to my other assumptions, enfranchising and getting and encouraging young people to vote and to participate and etc. is part of a strategy, it seems to me, for encouraging European identity, because all of the survey data show that the older you are, the less likely you are to feel European, or even half, even half and half, so to speak.
So we're back to the distribution, labors, and the dimension of solidarity. And I think it's really important to grapple with the recovery fund, as Claudia,
for example,
encouraged us to do. And I
Look,
would argue,
we'll see whether the recovery fund results in massive misuse and everything, because it's a huge amount of money, and the temptation to misappropriate it to friends of what is going to be very great.
And I would also,
And the EU has no administrative capacity, or very little, so it doesn't have enough monitoring capacity really to be able to follow up. So that worries me a lot.
but there are people who do have, and they're called citizens. So this is why I made the
Okay.
proposal for a democratic panopticon apply to the recovery fund because it's citizens everywhere and journalists, etc.,
Mm.
that can actually monitor.
That's
And,
it,
and the EU has allies that it's not using, and that's part of the problem. But Thomas, you wanted to jump in, then Ulrike, and then we're gonna, if you don't mind, everyone, unless there's somebody who has a pressing, Andrea, did you want to jump in? Okay, so I mean, I'm looking also, Ulrike, no? But we want to keep 10 minutes at the end to kind of talk about where we go, how we move forward with this project. Thomas.
Just very briefly, because it's getting late. First of all, thank you very much for these papers. It was a pleasure to read them. And it was also important at the beginning that you mentioned no feasibility consideration. No new treaty.
At this point, maybe later, okay?
Thomas, speak as loud as you can so people can hear you on the screen.
No, I said just it was important to make it clear that there are no feasibility considerations and no new treaty or no new constitution, because I wanted to suggest precisely that it should be examined actually the feasibility, at least to some extent. Why I'm saying this because I was participating in the European Convention in the group which was basically making all the real decisions, the government representatives. So before each plenary we met, and it was at the time of Vittorino, who was there on behalf of the Commission. And basically each time when we reached a sensitive issue, it became clear that the group of representatives, the member state representatives, had a very different view from whatever was discussed.
Yes.
So there's a huge amount of discussion ongoing, but basically what was important was decided in this small group. And that's why I was happy to hear that you wanted to make this, whatever it becomes, a representation-based exercise, which I fully agree with. On the issue of unanimity being discarded, it's precisely one of these issues which will never happen. I think we all know that, and it must be taken into consideration. The passerelle clauses, there are 6 or 7 very precise cases listed in the treaty. They have never been used with 1 or 2 exceptions in the last since.
And when a passerelle is used,
Yes.
is it forever in that field, or is it for that specific decision?
It's for that specific decision.
That's what I thought.
Yes.
It's not a
So
structural,
basically-
it's not a structural thing, so it
Basically,
doesn't.
if you look at the treaty, you have, I mean, highlight exactly, what is it relevant for, but with 1 or 2 exceptions, it has never been used.
Family law, for example, no? Acknowledging.
It was one, I can't remember exactly, one very famous one, which came up during the crisis, the EMU crisis, was precisely to help establish that special instrument, which actually provided a solution to the crisis. But that was a one-off, it was working well. But it has.
Well, but that's similar to the citizens initiative, which was, we'll never see a citizens initiative. It's got so many subordinate clauses that no one will ever be able.
Yes.
So.
Did you want to
And
comment?
just one final issue which hasn't come up at all, that I fully understand this critique of liberalism, where we've reached the end of liberal democracy. What we have to take into account is that there is a serious risk that the illiberals, led by Orban, but which is not just on his own, will be very happy to jump on any such narrative. So whatever we come up with, in our papers, I think we should also look at where we create the eye of a propagandist from the other side. They are looking for these kind of issues and they will jump on them. This is just a general remark.
Thank you, Thomas. And it sounds like when you say we do in our papers, that you're already volunteering for one. So
Just to
this is a good thing.
simplify.
No, it would be just wonderful to have you, Ulrike, and then we move on to the last few minutes on where we go from here.
Yeah, I was wondering, I must confess, not read everything so much in detail, but the word power, the term power doesn't appear.
Term what?
Power.
Okay.
Redistribute. So what you are proposing, even if it's a very modest series of modest proposals for reform, It aims at or requires power redistribution, the redistribution of European political power. And this between the institutions, between society, social contract, and the functioning and working of the Europolis. But how to make this work? For me, a linchpin is always the European Council, the Council of the EU, in their various formations. They, and you say this, they convene behind closed doors. And it's for researchers really a big problem to find out who stands for what. They give press conferences in the aftermath, but they are fragmented, a fragmented picture, contradictory. Some journalists get behind the scenes, but so how to get the council? This would be really a very big progress. And a step.
Well, that is advocated. I mean, more publicity,
advocate
that's
this, yeah.
advocated now. But you're absolutely, I mean, there's a very good reason why I do not mention power. I mean, the entire focus of these papers is what is called Europeanization or European integration by stealth. Sneaking up on it, so to speak. The idea is to introduce things which, yes, they may eventually have important implications for power, but you don't say that, so to speak. You introduce, the whole thing is process, not product, so to speak. So don't, jump ahead, because if you jump ahead, you won't suggest anything. You'll have exactly the kind of reaction that he mentioned. That is, as soon as you say anything innovative, there will be some, you will be immediately pushed aside as unfeasible, etc. And we want to get people to consider these things and then see whether they begin to have some kind of an effect. So you're right, there's not a mention of power because the entire project is stealthy, sneaking up on these
Why is it
things.
good though, Philip? I mean, integration by stealth is a term that we
I don't want to say that to everybody.
I understand, but even,
it is the
but
underlying.
even for us as a self-reflective, and this is slowly moving to what do we do with this project? Because as self-reflective scholars, we have criticized integration by stealth, non-democratic.
I understand
So,
that.
If you, I didn't read your proposals that way, but before you have a word, we have one last hand, Tobjar.
Hi, thank you. Torbjørn Jednaker, Peter Plans Institute, also visiting scholar at the Robert Schuman Center. So sorry for not coming down the hill, but this is a very interesting project. Just curious, because the proposals on the European Parliament didn't mention the role of the media. And I think what was really interesting to observe is this kind of TV election debate that happened in 2019. So is there any lessons from there? I don't know if this has probably been researched, but if there are any lessons to pick up from that in terms of kind of making the European Parliament and the election more visible to citizens and perhaps attract more young people. So that's one question. And then another one is about the report number 5. It also mentions the relevance of, or it suggests that perhaps advisory council should be added to each of the EU institutions and EU bodies. So I just want to mention that this exists for roughly half of EU agencies. I've been doing some work on that together with Madalina Busoik. And what we find is that this is not really driven by the European legislators. It's mainly driven by the EU agencies themselves. So I think here is perhaps something that is a potential for kind of small baby steps to be taken. But then one thing is the regulation of it, but what is happening in practice. So I just want to highlight that EU agencies often discuss extremely specialized issues. So even within the group of interest groups that follow these issues, even within that group, there is a lot of challenges in actually having the resources to follow it. So I think just having access to this type of council for an interest group or a citizen group might not be enough, because they also need to be able to have the resources to participate. So if this is an idea, I think it makes sense to connect it with maybe the role of there is kind of the possibility of having funding from the EU to societal civil society groups. So I think kind of if you give more work to civil society organizations, you also should help them do this work or pay them for it in a way. I mean, I don't mean that they should be paid to be in the council, but they need to have the resources to participate. And I see it in my work on EU agencies, interest groups that are following their work are really struggling because it's so extremely specialized. So, but thank you for this. I think it's a very fascinating project, and I hope to read the other reports when they will come out.
Yeah.
Thank you, but that's exactly the kind of thing I don't know, and so I appreciate this. So I invite you, we need to develop this more. I don't know what exists and what could be done to make it more. It's clearly whatever exists is not publicly well enough known so that it has any effect. So what could you do with it? So this is.
And indeed, I mean, Philip, if I may, I would suggest that when we put up the papers and we set up a process, we encourage people to have reactions that can be of three kinds. One is the usual comment, you know, paragraph, whatever that people do. Another can be literally 500 words, 1,000 words on something specific and technical. So you, I have to pronounce her name, Tarjord. Yeah, that was good. Thank you. Thank you. It's a challenge. And so we could imagine that you would describe what exists, what the problems are, that empowerment is not just passively giving access, and you would just describe it as an expansion in your name, you know, on the website, and it would be organic and grow that way. And that would be really fun. And then people can write longer papers, 2,000 to 3,000 on their own.
And are there some instances that work better than others, for example? Is it possible to compare this form of consultation and get some kind of an idea of how different rules or different subsidization schemes or whatever it is?
So we will expect something from you in the next few months, but in the meanwhile, Veronica has a figure, and we're slowly moving to the end.
Yeah, very short remark. I've read this before because you've circulated them before, and it's always been such a good and inspiring read, because I find that it's both too ambitious, bordering on, you know, visionary and naive, but also not ambitious enough, because it doesn't have that theory of progress that Eric also alluded to. Your theory of progress is these baby steps, which in fact is feasible. So even if you don't want to say it's feasible, you do think of feasibility quite a lot in your writing. And maybe it's not successful, that's why you're guarding against it. So, but it is something that I think that you are concerned with. Apart from that, a proposal that I would have is that you would have to have also a paper on mistakes. On mistakes, on the role of risk, the concept of risk, which is something that the European Union can work with quite well. The idea of taking risk and not suffering wild consequences that could destroy you. And what the EU is referring to this as an answer to risk-taking is this concept of resilience. That is a very large umbrella, but this is something that the EU has in a way that is quite remarkable. So we should really consider that also, since we're giving proposals of what to think about.
And of course, I don't think we want to throw it all on Philip and say, do a paper on this, do a paper on that. You might want to write a paper on this question of risk and all of that. Although I think we are encouraging you, to give a more explicit notion of what is progress in European integration somewhere, more explicit. And also maybe this question of feasibility, you don't have to say, okay, I take feasible things, but we, all of us, you know, say, well, under what condition would such and such proposal be more feasible? So, I mean, you know, something like that.
Well, okay, but what I'm hoping is that will come out of any discussion. I'm not how should I say, sufficiently. I mean, I'm in an odd position here. I've been associated with a kind of basic theory of European integration, but I've never spent a lot of time talking to people who are actually involved in it. So that's what I need. So that's why I feel limited in beyond this. So I can be naive because I don't have that kind of experience. I didn't expect this Danish foreign minister to jump up and say Denmark is not a small country. I mean, that's the kind of reaction that I was say unanticipated. I happen to be
more countries.
I
There are
happen
more
to
or
be-
less big countries.
I happen to be both part Swiss by origin and by education, and the Swiss are proud of being small. They've been avoiding all kinds of things, getting away with murder by being small. So it didn't occur to me that there was something wrong with being small, but apparently Danes are not like Swiss, so they're insulted by being called small. So anyway, I'm just saying, if I had, with more of, I don't have, that's the advantage of being naive, if you see what I mean, okay? So,
Well, naive is a beautiful thing, but we are running out of time. Do you want it like literally 10?
It's just an observation. My name is Jana. I'm a policy leader fellow here. I'm from Kazakhstan. And this research cluster of Professor Kalitsa is, for me, is more a platform of learning how to participate in academic discussion. And I'd like to thank you and to share what surprised me. My final project is about including civil society in developing development and implementation of education policy in Kazakhstan and in countries in transition. And what surprised me very much today in the discussion was that including civil society groups is very actual topical question for European Union countries as well. It surprised me very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jan, we will continue to discuss with you because we really do want to decenter and get the viewpoint from the rest of the world, very much at the center of what we do. So
I've actually, my dissertation was on exactly that topic in Brazil, interested in it. And that's where I came up with this idea of corporatism, or resuscitated it after. And the question isn't just consultation, it's what other criteria you use to select who you consult with, and whether or not you create associations that enjoy monopolies of representation, right? And even monopolies of membership in which you have to contribute. So the question of consultation of civil society doesn't end with the assumption that civil societies will produce themselves. They are crafted, they are massaged, they are manipulated in various ways, so that have a huge effect upon what actually then takes place as the result of these consultations. So that's all I'm adding to the
right.
picture.
Well, we all best plans, come to know. So I had this plan that we would talk about where do we go from here. But I think if Ulrike allows me, we can just simply, first of all, thank all of you and thank Philippe for a great conversation, and promise everyone that we will be having this discussion with Philippe, with Eric, and how we move this project forward. But you can note already that the idea is to have a set of papers of different size that will be in conversation with each other, and that for the next kind of couple of years. And that Ulrike will be not the only, but the major kind of bridge. So do you want to add anything, either of you, Philippe or
No, I
Ulrike,
think,
to where we
Philippe,
go?
you say in the introduction, you will start a debate. I think we are in the middle of the debate.
I want to, that's it.
And the debate, this discussion, this very microcosm of a discussion about Europolity has shown it's a network of different specializations, special knowledges, which we need to bring in, and we can bring in. And I think the EOI is a perfect place. We are perfectly placed.
Yeah, I think this is the place to start the debate, but I'm only starting it because, as I say, I don't mind being called naive because I am. I have not spent the amount, I spent a lot of time doing other research on very different places than the EU. So, and I'm not even a European technically, so that makes it maybe even more bizarre, but still, I just simply want to get it going, so to speak, and then learn something and hope that out of that, it will grow. That's all.
Thank you so much, Philippe. It's a wonderful initiative. We all love it. Please let's a little much, and we will all be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.